I'm Joyce Johnson, representing the Duke Symphony Orchestra League, and it is our pleasure to sponsor Soundbites gatherings before our concert. So, I'm glad you all ventured out on this nice warm day. But I think our maestro will warm us up even more when he tells us about this very interesting program that he has planned for us this weekend. So without further ado, I will let him tell us all about it. Maestro William Intriligator.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joyce, and welcome everybody. It's so great to see another really large crowd here. And yes, even though the weather has been cold and yucky, we will definitely make you feel wonderful this weekend with this wonderful program of beautiful music. Continuing our season-long theme of youth, I couldn't resist programming some pieces that were written by composers when they were very, very young. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit. And then in addition, we have a young soloist and a Youthful symphony by Haydn, even though he was very old when he wrote it, and all sorts of good things. Before we begin, I want to welcome some guests. We're going to bring them up a little later, but I want to start by welcoming our violin soloist, Grace Clifford. Welcome. And our guest conductor for the Ravel Mother Goose Suite is Benjamin Fierer, who's the conductor of our Youth Symphony. I also want to take a moment to thank our concert co-sponsors, Jim and Jean Gantz, who are here. We really appreciate your ongoing sponsorship. Thank you so much. Wonderful also that your daughter-in-law, who's on our board now, is here. Nicole, welcome. And I also want to welcome and thank Dr. Deborah LeBeau from Dubuque Gynecology and Obstetrics and their sponsorship, and your guest, Dee, too. So welcome. I think I messed up the name, Dubuque Obstetrics and Gynecology, right? That's it. Great. I also want to mention right off the top of the program here today that tonight the orchestra has an open rehearsal, and if you care to watch us actually work on the program, you can come to the Five Flags Theater. We ask that you get there a little early. The doors will be open from about, 6:30 till about 6:50, and the rehearsal actually starts at 7. And then you can take a place anywhere in the auditorium area and watch us as we actually dig in and rehearse a little bit for tomorrow night's and Sunday afternoon's performances. So that's free, and it's open to all ages. If you want to bring kids or grandkids, that's fine too. Some people really enjoy watching the process as the orchestra puts the pieces together. And it's kind of fun seeing the orchestra in blue jeans and stuff. That's tonight. We do those once or twice a year. Yes, so the program is really designed with that youthful theme, and the two composers that come to my mind when I think of youthful prodigies are Mozart and Mendelssohn. Mozart, of course, it's well known that even at the age of like 4 or 5, he was playing piano, starting to compose little pieces. We're going to be performing his first symphony as a sort of overture on the program. And his first symphony was written at the tender age of 8. Yes, yeah. He started playing keyboard. It's a little bit unclear whether he was 3 or 4 years old when he started playing the keyboard. And he was 5 by the time he started writing pieces. But he wrote his first symphony at age 8. And at that time, he was actually on tour with his family in London. They played 2 or 3 times for Mad King George III, at Buckingham. And he was, it's kind of a well-known story, partially through the movie Amadeus, but Mozart's father, Leopold Mozart, was also a musician, and he sort of paraded around his children, who were these youthful prodigies, to many countries all over Europe, playing for kings and princes and other courts, and just in general. It was sort of a little bit of a circus show, Come see the amazing young Mozarts. He would say that Wolfgang could play violin or piano or keyboard or organ. He can identify every tone by ear. He could play underneath a cloth and not see the keyboard. All these little tricks that he was doing. So he was a little bit of like a sideshow kind of kind of thing. It helped the family raise money, obviously. At that time in London, the symphonies of one of Bach's sons, Johann Sebastian Bach's sons, Johann Christian Bach, were very popular. And it's amazing that this first symphony already shows that Mozart must have heard some of those Johann Christian Bach symphonies and absorbed the style right away. It has sort of a little bit of a trademark of that other composer, who was, you know, a little older established composer. But there's also something distinctively Mozartian about it. Namely, there's a theme that comes in the second movement that is the theme that he will use in several other pieces over his lifetime, including his last symphony. Almost as if he knew it would be his last symphony because he tied it into his first symphony. The Jupiter Symphony uses this famous theme in the finale. Da, da, dee, da, ba, 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 ba. You know that from the Jupiter Symphony, of course. That theme is presented in the French horns in the second movement. There's this wonderful tie-in. Another interesting tie-in is that he uses another section of this symphony in another one of his final pieces, the Magic Flute. When we performed it for you last April in a stage production, I maybe didn't have a time to tell you about that at Soundbites, but there is a little snippet near the beginning of the Magic Flute, not in the overture, but in the first piece after that, where he quotes the first symphony. It's amazing. It's as though he really knew that when the time he was writing that maybe he was near the end. Because Mozart did keep mental track of everything he wrote. Part of his genius wasn't just musical, it was also, I don't know, somehow organizational too. At one point in his life, he sat down and he wrote down the catalog of every single thing he wrote in order, including the first few bars of music of each piece. That sort of set the standard and laid the groundwork for musicologists years later who decided, hey, this is something we should do for all the composers. So then in the 1820s or 30s, I think it was, maybe even a little later, maybe around 40 years or 30 or 40 years after Mozart passed away, somebody, a musicologist, said, okay, we're going to do this and use Mozart's own catalog as the basis, but we're going to make it even more complete, because there are some pieces that he didn't want posterity to know about, but we found them. Things like that. So now that there's this numbering system for Mozart's pieces that have a K in front of it, a Herschel number, and that's the name of that musicologist in the 1800s who decided to do that. It's a lovely little piece. I'll play you a little example of this, and just bear in mind that this is from an 8-year-old. All right, here we go. I can get this to work. A cute thing is that he uses some harmonies that have these unusual dissonances that perhaps are considered wrong and not liked by the books. And he's already showing a little bit of daring. All these like sitting ninths. Adorable, isn't it? And the orchestra hadn't developed to the point where there were additional forces other than strings, oboes, and horns. Sometimes a harpsichord would be involved at that time in the 1760s. But you know, in the next decades, bassoons, flute, clarinet would join, trumpets, and timpani would join. So this is scored just for strings, French horns, and oboes. See if I can find that moment where the French horns play the Jupiter theme. I'm going to have to search here. Just a second. I'm almost there. I'm moving past it, actually. It sort of sets a real mood with the second movement. It's sort of like a nocturne. Well, I'm going to have to skip that. It's subtle when you hear it. The French horns will come in with that little tone, tone, tone. Also of interest is the key that he chose to write this in, which is not necessarily what you would think of writing a symphony for primarily strings in. Normally they would play in a key like D, G, or something like that, but he chose the key of E flat, which throughout his life was very meaningful to him. And it's the same key that most of the Magic Flute is in. It's a key that had a sort of different kind of connotation, I think. It also may reflect the fact that maybe he was primarily a keyboard player at that point, even though he could play violin. So maybe this was something that he wrote at the keyboard. So that's interesting. And it's going to be a lovely little opening overture. And the thing is that unfortunately this piece is almost never played. And it's nice to hear this really young Mozart and kind of get a feeling for these themes and the rhythmic vitality and all these little trademarks that will appear later in his music, in the music that maybe we know much better. After we play that, we're going to play the Scherzo from Mendelssohn's Octet. Now, Mendelssohn wrote his Octet for a double string quartet at the age of 16, and it was an incredible achievement for that age. In many respects, when we hear the young music of Mozart, it's like, well, that's young Mozart, it's not his masterpieces. But when you hear some of the young music of Mendelssohn, okay, granted, his teenage years, not like 8, like Mozart was, you have a masterpiece. That's what's amazing about Mendelssohn, is that he actually was writing masterpieces that were like trademark Mendelssohn, like quintessential Mendelssohn at age 16 and on. His Overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream from that same year and this Octet were the two pieces that really ushered in that period. He had been writing for years and years before that. He had this cushy life. He grew up in Berlin, wealthy parents. His dad was a banker. He came from a very well-established family. His grandfather was a famous philosopher. Like a lot of privileged people at that time, he grew up with speaking many languages, painting and drawing. He was an excellent artist. He knew poetry and literature like nobody's business. He was performing Shakespeare plays with his siblings, and I mean, incredible. And then he had a house orchestra that his parents paid for at his disposal. So every weekend he would write these, when in his youth he would write these string symphonies, mostly strings, and sometimes occasionally another instrument. So there are these early Mendelssohn pieces, his string symphonies, which are also brilliant. And maybe from around the time he was 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. But right when we get to age 16 with his Octet, and then his Overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream, it's like everything was taken up a level, and we have the sort of that stamp of the mature Mendelssohn. It's amazing, really. So how are we performing the Scherzo from the Octet? It's originally for 8 players. Well, later in life, he took that piece and he orchestrated it to become an alternative Scherzo movement for his first symphony. He was very self-critical about his music. He was always revising it, coming up with different versions, reluctant to get it out there. And there are many alternative versions to even our most beloved pieces, even the Violin Concerto, which is also on this program. There is an original version that is sometimes not performed. Even his Italian Symphony, which sounds so perfect, it's hard to imagine that he didn't want posterity to know that piece. He didn't think it was ready yet. He was still working and tinkering on it when he died. Amazing. But all these pieces have that same kind of trademark that he established with the Octet. And so we're going to do that orchestration of this beautiful little 4-minute Octet, and it has a quality like A Midsummer Night's Dream with the fairy-like lightness, where it's just mysterious. It brings up the world of A Midsummer Night's Dream, the world of the fairies of Titania and Oberon, and it sort of evokes that whole feeling. After that, we're going to perform the Violin Concerto, and we'll talk about that in a moment with Grace. And after intermission, we'll have a change of pace with music by Maurice Ravel, the wonderful French composer, and his Mother Goose Suite. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. I want to mention just a little bit about the Hyden Symphony, which will end the program. I mentioned that Haydn was older when he wrote this. This was not a youthful piece for Haydn. This is symphony number 94 out of 104. Yes, he wrote a lot of symphonies. Many people forget that it was really Haydn who established the form of the symphony that influenced so many later generations of composers. Up until that time, symphonies were usually in 3 movements. Symphonies like, for instance, Johann Christian Bach and the early Mozart symphony that starts the program. But over the course of the 1760s, 70s, 80s, even before that, in the 1750s, Haydn, working for the same employer, the Prince Esterhazy, every couple of weeks had to churn out a symphony. And he established this idea of the 4-movement symphony, just like he really established the string quartet as the sort of form that it took as well. What's so interesting is that Haydn was working really in isolation. He was, the Esterhazy family had 2 residences, one near the city of Vienna, one out in the boondocks. They were both palaces, and both with theaters, so that would seat like 400 people. And he actually produced many operas there as well. We don't think of Haydn when you think of operas, but I think he wrote something like 28 operas, of which maybe 15 have survived. So yeah, they would produce entire operas there as well. But he had this orchestra at his disposal. Sounds familiar, like later when Mendelssohn had that when Mendelssohn was younger. But this was much earlier. We're talking about in the 1750s, 60s, 70s, whereas Mendelssohn was born in 1809. By the way, Mendelssohn was born just 3 days away from Abraham Lincoln. Anyway, I'm a little bit all over the place today. Fun little trivia things. This Haydn Symphony is special for many reasons, because at this point he had already established the form of the symphony, and he'd done so many daring things and creative things with programmatic music in the symphonies, and featuring different solos in the orchestra, from within the orchestra, within the symphonies, and establishing the 4-movement structure of it with the slow movement and then the minuet movement. This is the symphony that sort of takes the 3rd movement, minuet, which used to be an old court dance in a slower tempo so the nobility could dance it, and sort of flips it on its head and increases the tempo, and is the way leading toward what Beethoven would ultimately call his Scherzo movements. So this is the symphony where the 3rd movement really is called a minuet, but it's too fast to dance it, really. And he wrote this very unusual tempo indication of allegro molto. And the way that it's performed, it's clear that, this is the point at which the 3rd movement of symphonies stopped being a dance for royalty and started being more about amusement for the bourgeois, if you will, and about keeping it kind of fun and interesting. The word scherzo, which later would be the name of this movement, this type of movement, means literally joke. And so yes, joke. Let's talk about Haydn, because when you think of Haydn, I'd like the first thing you think about to be humor. That is so much of what his music is about. This symphony is called the Surprise Symphony, but all of his symphonies have surprises. I mean, musical jokes, if you will, where he sets you up to expect something to come next musically, and then that expectation is dashed in a creative, funny way. You have to really follow along the mood of the music to sort of get the humor, though. But this symphony has the most famous joke of all of his symphonies, and that's why it's called the Surprise Symphony. In the slow movement, there is quite a surprise. Now, the story goes that he wanted to wake up the audience during the slow movement, after they had had a big meal and a lot to drink. But he had actually denied that later in his life. He said, no, I was just looking for something extraordinary that would, make this a really special concert. This was only his 2nd symphony that he had written for the London Symphonies. Again, he started out being relatively provincial with working for this family for nearly 50 years. And then when he sort of when the Prince Nicholas Esterhazy passed away and it passed on to Paul Esterhazy, he wasn't interested in a court composer quite as much, so suddenly Haydn was free. He still got his salary and he still got to keep the Kapellmeister title for the Esterhazy family, but he didn't have to stay in those 2 houses as he had for so many years. So he was free to travel, and an entrepreneur named Solomon invited him to London, where he was feted, and he got an honorary degree at Oxford, and that was why he wrote the Oxford Symphony, number 92, for that. And so he wanted to make a big splash. Also, there was a friend of his, a former student, Pleyel, who was also doing concerts at the same time in London. And the concert promoters were kind of making it so that they were in competition with each other. Even though Haydn and Pleyel got together great, and they actually had meals together, and they enjoyed each other's company, but the concert promoters created this artificial competition between Haydn and Pleyel. So Haydn was like, okay, fine, I'll do something kind of extraordinary. So he starts the movement. I don't want to take too much time with this, but it's very simple, almost like a nursery rhyme. You can see how this fits in perfectly with the youthful theme, right? The melody is even like something youthful. Just a huge outburst suddenly comes in. Bam! And he might repeat it once or twice later on in that movement. But really, all the movements of this 4-movement symphony are full of incredible surprises and jokes. The last movement especially, actually. Yeah, it's a wonderful, delightful piece. And another thing that I thought of when I was programming this whole season of Youth, I thought, well, you have to have some Haydn on there, because there's something just about that spirit that is so youthful, even though he wrote these as an older man. I want to invite Ben Feirer, our guest conductor, up now. Ben is the conductor of our Dubuque Symphony Youth Orchestra. They are celebrating their 50th anniversary this year, and that is the inspiration for us having this whole season of theme of youth for the Dubuque Symphony Orchestra. Ben will learn more about him, but he's already brought incredible energy and dynamism to the youth orchestra. The reports are extremely glowing, and I'm very happy to share the podium with him and invite him to conduct the Mother Goose Suite on the program this weekend. Let's hear a little bit more from Ben Feirer. Welcome. Hey, here, you can take this one.
Get my own microphone here.
That's great.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Feirer. So happy to be with you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ravel, a little bit about the youth orchestra. We are performing our concert on this very special 50th anniversary of the youth orchestra. Next Sunday, we're doing 3 pieces: the Vivaldi Violin Concerto, featuring our young artist, the Schubert Rosamunde Overture, and third, an arrangement of pieces by Richard Wagner, opera composer, from his wonderfully long opera Meistersinger, which is typically about 5 hours. We're compressing it down to just about 10 and a half minutes for you. So give you the abridged version on that.
That's great. And that concert's at Five Flags as well. So
Yes.
it's in the Five Flags Theater, and it's very reasonable. Something like $5 for kids and $10 for adults, or something like that. I'm not sure the exact number, but that is a week from Sunday in the evening with all of our youth ensembles. We have 4 ensembles. The youth orchestra that Ben conducts is the oldest and most advanced of the 4 groups. That's great. Now tell us a little bit about who you are. Where'd you come from?
Well, I came from a long way, not as far as you, but I'm from Long Island, New York. We were talking at the table. You can tell my accent when I say, we need to talk. How's the coffee? Is it good? Okay. So I did my schooling kind of on the East Coast, and my wife, who is a violinist in the Milwaukee Symphony, she got her job in Milwaukee, and I said, where can I go to school that's close to her? And so I ended up going to Northwestern and just finished my school there in June. And
For a doctorate in orchestral
for a
conducting.
doctorate.
Yes.
So I am officially a doctor. I can't heal you, but maybe heal your soul. I don't know.
Yes.
We can see. And I also teach orchestra and opera at Northern Illinois University down in DeKalb, Illinois.
It's so wonderful. And then also on the faculty there is our principal, Horn Kelly Langenberg. So you guys
Yes.
are colleagues down there. That's
Yes.
great. So, and then tell them about how you were a trombonist before you turned to conducting. You got Tell them a little bit about that.
Let's go way back, okay? So I wanted to play percussion, let's be honest.
I did too. Yeah.
I wanted to play percussion, but my band director, I was kind of, for that age, tall and lanky. Like, not much has changed. So he's like, no, you got to play trombone because you can reach that far position. And, I was like, percussion, I want the drum set. I like the rock music, But I ended up on trombone, and I'm so grateful for that. I love, for instance, we were just discussing Mozart was one of the first composers to brilliantly use trombone in the orchestra, and I love, actually, some of my favorite music as a trombonist is not the loud, bombastic Wagner. It's actually when we're playing choral works of Haydn, Mozart, that the trombones are used in a very angelic sense of reinforcing the choir. It's some of my favorite playing is in that setting.
That's great. Do you still play trombone?
I do, yes. When the phone calls,
you get an offer?
I get an offer, and I say, "Are you sure?" I'll dust off the cobwebs and play it a little bit. And basically, what happened is, it's always funny asking conductors, what was that? There's no conductor path. You just sort of jump in at some point, and I remember. This is about to get a little personal. There was a girl I wanted to impress, and she played piano, and so I was very nervous, and I asked her, "Do you want to play a concerto? I have an orchestra." And she said, "Yeah, I want to do Mozart Concerto, number 27.
Okay.
Great, let's rehearse next week." I didn't have an orchestra. Didn't have one. I called my friends, "Help, I need your help." I ended up starting an orchestra, and
that's really impressive.
Now on my resume, it looks like, oh, it's quite an entrepreneurial method. Yeah, so, and then I just enjoyed the challenge of it being, it's such a difference being in the back of the orchestra in a supportive role versus being in front. And I love thinking about conducting, like the word conductor, almost in the scientific sense of a metal that conducts energy. And I find that that's, rather than trying to kind of just imprint my own ideas, sometimes I really like to just encourage the orchestra to feel like I'm enhancing what they're already bringing to the table. And it's been a journey ever since. So I ended up doing a master's at Yale in trombone, and the first day, my first lesson with an amazing trombone teacher who played in the Empire Brass, wonderful, wonderful teacher. And my first lesson, I said, "I think I want to be a conductor." Is that all right? And his wife was a conductor, so he said, "I understand." So he was very supportive, and I ended up doing a second master's at Penn State, the wonderful teacher there, and then of course later the doctorate at Northwestern. So,
all I can say is we are so lucky that you're part of the Dubuque Youth. And I've been so impressed with Ben conducting the Dubuque Symphony Orchestra this week. He really knows exactly what he wants. He's extremely clear. He's very musical. And tell us a little bit briefly about the Mother Goose Suite. We have these 5 beautiful little miniatures.
Absolutely, and I'm going to try my best with technology. I'm not quite in the Bluetooth wavelength there, but I have, for you a little bit, Ravel was known as a brilliant orchestrator. And that means that many of his works started out on the piano, and he would decide, okay, what is the best instrument to capture the character, the quality of this? And for these movements, there's such a specific way that he did it that you almost can't imagine it started as a piano piece. It just sounds like, oh, he started with the orchestra. I'll give you an example of one such thing, which is in the 4th movement, which is Beauty of the Beast. And I'll give you 3 different spots, little excerpts. He starts the movement with the Beauty, which he writes in the clarinet. Now I'll say he's a beautiful man. Corey Mackey.
Our principal clarinet.
Principal clarinet. So he's doing a great job of describing the beauty. The Beast, interestingly enough, he uses the contrabassoon. The contrabassoon is the one. It's kind of near the trombones in the back, very heavy. It's a double bassoon, and it sounds an octave below the bassoon. It's in the real basement, almost just rumbly. It's like before there was a subwoofer, contrabassoon.
Yeah.
That's accomplished it.
Yep.
Later, the beast is transformed into a prince, and Ravel accomplishes this by having the concertmaster play harmonics. So he writes in the extreme high, low ranges and everything in between. So I'll play a little bit for you from the fourth movement, starting with the beauty. So should I hold this up?
Sure. Hear it, right?
You hear the clarinet?
It has a very Satie gymnopédie kind of thing, and gymnopédie was written beforehand, so I think he must have known that too.
If it doesn't sound good, blame it to Google phone. It's not Apple. Blame them. Now, what he does, I have this queued up.
Oh, great.
Now we're going to hear the contrabassoon, which my brother played bassoon. He played contrabassoon. It is a beast. Yeah. So. So as promised, there's the beast. It's incredible. He was such a creative mind to think of, that's the instrument I need. And then I'll just fast forward to the end where the prince is transformed. Here we are.
It's the same melody as the contrabassoon was, but now it's a high violin.
Fade out action. That's just a little taste for tonight. Incredible colors and elegance of his writing. That it's simple but not simplistic. It's
Yeah.
brilliant.
And he wrote it as a little gift for two children that he was very fond of, and he wrote the piano pieces first and then orchestrated it himself later. And it just really creates this beautiful mood. Even from the very beginning, it has a simplicity about it. It really captures youthful innocence. And the different movements you have, like the Tom Thumb and the Fairy Garden and things like that nature, a lot of sort of favorite Mother Goose stories. And you're doing such a wonderful job with it, Ben. Thank
I
you.
should mention that the two children he wrote it for were 6 and 7. I don't know what I was doing at 6 and 7, but it wasn't playing this piece.
Oh yeah, he wrote it for them to play.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, exactly.
Great.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you, William.
We're so lucky to have him as the conductor of our youth symphony. It's really wonderful to have him be part of this concert. You know, on our last classics concert, we had members of our youth ensembles as narrators for Britain's Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. So we're sort of keeping that idea of the youth ensembles are being such an important part of the Dubuque Symphony Orchestra and the inspiration for this youth theme at every concert. So when it came time to program Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto, I said, I'd really like to get a really brilliant young soloist. And so I emailed my friend Miriam Freed. Miriam is the wonderful violinist who's performed with us twice before. She did the Beethoven Concerto and the Brahms Concerto, and she is a master teacher as well, and she has some of the finest young violinists in her studio that she teaches. So I asked Miriam, is there somebody really special, somebody young who you'd recommend? And the first name she mentioned was Grace Clifford, who's from Australia originally, and has been studying with Miriam starting this year. Actually, at that time, Grace was at the Curtis Institute studying with a few other people. She was like, she's just going to start studying with me that fall, and she's amazing. So Please welcome Grace Clifford. I'm sort of stuck here on this one, so I'm going to have to stay close here. Welcome so much. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and what you've been doing.
Hello, and thank you for having me. I just want to say that upon first welcome in Dubuque, I'm just flabbergasted really by how warm and welcoming everyone is. And it's got such a wonderful feel here, the small town feel, and yeah, so thank you.
Well, thank you for that.
And yes, I'm from Sydney, Australia, and I studied in Philadelphia for 5 years and just moved to Boston, so I've been there since September.
So I was asking you this yesterday when we first met in person for the first time, that you must have been pretty young when you left Australia to study in Philadelphia.
I was 15, which did feel quite young because it's so far from home. I definitely missed my mom, and but it's a vibrant city, and there's a lot of art and a lot to offer musically, educationally. So I was lucky to go there.
And for some folks, they are more familiar with Juilliard as a name for a music conservatory, but Curtis really has such a special and distinctive place among the top conservatories. Maybe you can explain a little bit what's special about Curtis, where you studied.
Yes, well, Curtis is extremely small. Juilliard is quite a large school, and it also has a drama department. Curtis is just opera, but they have a small opera department and piano, 2 conducting fellows, and the rest are pianists, string players, woodwind. So just enough for 1 orchestra, and that means that everyone in the school knows everyone else very well, probably too well sometimes, and it's a very one-on-one student-faculty ratio, really. So.
And what percentage of those students are like still in their high school years versus college? Whereas I know Juilliard also has a pre-college division, but it's more known as a other degrees.
Well, yes, Curtis. One of my friends at Curtis came to Curtis when he was 10 and graduated at 21. So it was really a combination of primary school, high school, and college. So there's about, I would say, 20%, maybe 30% are younger than 17 when they come, or 18. But then we also do have a few older students doing artist diploma, and so it's a very diverse mix, and also a very international school. So I think perhaps 20% from Korea, and maybe 10% from China, and then we have Europeans and Australians, obviously.
How many were there other Australians there when you were there?
In my last year, I was joined by one other.
Good. And being only 20, 21, I don't know exactly your age, it's also remarkable that you've already played with concertos with orchestras several times, including this Mendelssohn Concerto. Do you want to tell us a little about some of those experiences that you've had?
Yes, well, playing with orchestra is one of the greatest joys because we spend so much time on our own in the practice room. And you're listening to yourself and you're criticizing yourself, and it can be quite discouraging. But then when you play with an orchestra, there's this real sense of talking really to other people and feeling that sense of community, which is what music is all about, and it's why we're all here. So that is really what makes it so fulfilling and worthwhile. So yes, I've had some experiences, particularly in Australia, and just this summer I played this piece with the Malaysian Philharmonic, which was a very interesting experience. And yeah, so it's wonderful to be able to meet new people as well as play old music.
You know, I'm so glad you mentioned about playing together, because the first rehearsal with a soloist in the orchestra is sometimes extremely telling. And last night we had our first rehearsal together with Grace, and I was shocked and so pleased at the amount of real chamber music that she was making with the orchestra. In this concerto, there's particularly lovely parts for the woodwind scoring and the woodwinds, and she was continuously making music with them, even though she's standing in front. she's turned around, she's gesturing to the clarinet, she's inviting them, and others in other sections of the orchestra. And you don't see that with a lot of soloists who are sort of sometimes wrapped up in their own world or sort of in a cocoon or isolated from the rest of the orchestra. But she was extremely, like, not just communicative, but generous and kind of inviting, I would say, to the orchestra, which was really impressive. I really liked that. Yeah, that was great. Do you want to tell them a little bit about the Mendelssohn? And I mean, I know it's a familiar concerto for a lot of people. For a lot of them, it's one of their absolute favorites. Tell us what it's like to play a piece like the Mendelssohn.
Yes. Well, how many people are familiar with the concerto? Have heard it? Yes. Well, it is so loved and it's so often played, and there are so many reasons for that. The melodies are beautiful. They're singable, they're memorable, and they're also inviting and generous, I would say. But it's important to remember that when Mendelssohn first started writing this piece, he was probably 29, and he died when he was 38, and it was a 6-year process. So when he finished, he was 3 years away from his death, but still such a young man. And it's very important for us and for audiences, I think, to remember that even though this piece has been played so many hundreds of times and heard so much, that it is as meaningful and fresh emotionally now as it was when Mendelssohn felt it and wrote it down. That with the passage of time, it does not become stale or less relevant to the human experience, because people, of course, people change, but we don't change in those essential ways. And Mendelssohn wrote down things that are just as heartfelt and touching to us now. So the challenge is, when we've played it so many times, to feel the surprise at differences that he made, and to not revel so much in just how beautiful and pleasing it is, but also remember that he is challenging us in certain ways to feel things that are, frustration and passion that is almost uncomfortable. In fact, he wrote about the very opening of the piece. When he first thought of it, he wrote to his friend that the opening gave him no peace. It was in his head, and it's in E minor. It's quite restless, and you can imagine him walking around with this theme. So yeah, so it's listen with open ears and